Hello, how are you doing? My name is Alex. My name is Alex. I'm a voice actor and a composer, and this year I began working with MeatCanyon. Been working on Monster Lab this year. I did the music for it, and I got to do voices here and there as well, so make sure you check it out. It was a lot of fun to work on. Today, I want to talk about one of the parodies that I worked on, his most recent one, the Dream parody. I want to talk a little bit about my process, what it looks like when I get a cut of the cartoon, and just give you an inside look on what it's like to be a composer. It sounds really lame when I say it out loud. So without further ado, here is my Cubase project. Cubase is my DAW of choice these days. I came from Logic. I used it for over 10 years, but about a year and a half ago, I switched to Windows, so I had to pick a new DAW. So I went to Cubase. It came highly recommended by a lot of people. I miss some things about Logic, but I'm happy I made the switch. I'm glad that I have experience in both, so I can hop back and forth. Still have my old iMac, so if I ever need to use Logic, it's there. So when I get a cut of the cartoon, it's usually earlier in development, so not all the animation is finished yet, and there's usually never any sound effects. It's just dialogue, and often the cut that I receive is not finished animation-wise. Sometimes the timing isn't locked, so if I get started early enough and I receive an update, I'll have to change my music to fit the new cut, which can be annoying and time-consuming, but it's necessary because I have to get as early of a start as possible, because I usually only have a matter of days to write the score. With this one, I think it's a 6-minute animation, and I think there was about 5 minutes of music needed, and I had about 4 days. So gotta get an early start. I'll start by showing you the ending scene because that's where I started with the music. I started with the ending because that's as big as the music is going to get. So I wanted to get the ideas out, flesh them out, and solidify them before going back and doing the rest of the animation and sprinkling those ideas throughout, which is a common technique. So here's the scene as I received it.
Beautiful. You're beautiful. Look at how beautiful he is! What was that thing? That's my son.
Quite disturbing indeed. At this point, we had already had a spotting session where you sit down with the creator or the producer and you decide when music comes in, when it goes out, and what kind of music. So I sat down with MeatCanyon, or Papa Meat as the kids like to call him, and we made those decisions. He mentioned inspirations like The Shining, which if you've seen the finished video, there's a lot of parallels. He mentioned Eyes Wide Shut. He liked the piano that they used in the score for that movie. I brought up E.T. for the ending because it felt very grand, and he agreed. He was like, yeah, I want it to be huge. I want it to be epic. I want it to be heartwarming, you know? So those were some of the main inspirations for the score. I usually start off writing out my ideas on piano tracks. So I'll just play this for you first, and then I'll explain a little bit about it. That's that. Some clear inspiration from the movie The Fly with Jeff Goldblum, which he mentioned during the spotting session, actually. So we wanted it to feel like The Fly, and what I ended up doing was this, which it has this longing feeling to it because we're dancing higher and higher. We go to the leading tone right before going back up. So I wanted to complete the octave in the phrase, but I took my time getting there. Then the next chord goes down to F, and the melody goes right, but the chord underneath it is F major, and the melody starts with the minor third. It's a really crunchy feeling that I've heard Thomas Newman use in The Green Mile, one of my favorite movies, and it's always It's always been inspiring to me that it's like, because, major is happy, minor is sad. Both at the same time? I don't know what to feel right now. So I've always wanted to use this. It's not something that is really called for very often, but it's really powerful. So I change back and forth between major and minor depending on what the melody is doing at that very moment. So then the last chord, I wanted to finally give that octave jump. So it starts off with just a clean octave. So the first phrase had me jumping around to reach the octave. Second chord, just building up higher. Then finally. So let's move on to the latter half of the scene where he opens the window and he looks out and he leaps up and he pushes his way out the window and he's free and he's flying away and it's just grand and epic. And the guy says, "What was that thing?" And he proudly says, "That's my son." So, and then it cuts to black. That's got to be the E.T. ending. Just blaring orchestra, major chords, right? So you might find the piano sketch is very underwhelming, but try to use your imagination because we'll get there.
Kinda makes you wanna cry, doesn't it?
Let's take a look at my tempo track where I have a bunch of nodes you can see here that it speeds up, then slows down, speeds back up again. And it's helpful to have that click that slows down as I intend it to for rubato or dramatic effect and back up again. So I can play to the click track. Here, it sounds like this, so I don't have to snap at you. Then we slow down dramatically, back up, down and up. And it's really helpful to play to a click track, especially when, earlier I was just using pianos, but later on I'm going to be using full orchestra. Here's the winds and the brass and the percussion and the strings. I like to play as much of the MIDI as I can on the keyboard. I like to perform it, because if you just click the notes into existence, things can sound kind of robotic. So it's really helpful to actually, the human imperfections, the mistakes, really add to the realism when you're using a digital orchestra or digital instruments in general. I'll start by showing you the strings. This is EastWest Hollywood strings, and I believe this is where I started with the melody. Now, what I find really helpful to make my libraries sound more realistic is to layer them with other libraries, other sample libraries. So this is soaring strings by musical sampling playing the same thing. It's a different library, so it's different string players, different recording environment, different microphones and all that. Now together, they're going to sound real good. That's what we're going for. You'll notice that I have two tracks for the violins for EastWest Hollywood. That's because I have my divises out. That means I have half of the section on this track and the other half of the section on this track. And together, layered, they sound really good. They do have the patch together, but if I ever want to have half of them do one thing and the other half do another thing, I have them split out for that reason. And it sounds great when you use them separated and played at the same time, as opposed to using just a single patch that has both playing at the same time. It's really similar, but there's a subtle difference, and I really prefer to just have both divises playing simultaneously, and it also gives me the ability to split them later if they're going to hit different notes. Okay, now here's the whole string section put together. You see, I decided to add a suspension there. That wasn't in my original piano sketch. The piano sketch is there as a guide. You know, I can go ahead and make stuff up on the fly as I'm orchestrating. That's part of the process. Let's do some of the brass now. I used a combination of EastWest Hollywood brass and CineBrass, another good library, and of course mix those two together. The brass will definitely overpower the strings, so at this point I wanted the brass to be muted, which gives it this eerie sound. Very thin. With this section, I kind of heard in my head what I wanted with the build. I wanted to start with strings, leading it, and then have the brass come in underneath and become huge by there. This was going to be a French horn right here. Right? And this part was going to be some trumpet chords on top. And then this would be the strings holding their high notes. Then what really drives it is the low brass, which is a combination of tubas and trombones going like this. So, here's what that sounds like. Are you ready, kids? Nice. And that build-up I wanted to be almost a fake-out, so I wanted it to just have high strings and a trumpet melody. So here's what that sounds like. And it wouldn't be a grand John Williams ending without some timpanis going 5 1 5 1 5 1, which sounds like this. Now the final giant chord can't just be all the parts of the orchestra holding a single note. That's not going to sound very good. You need movement in there. Without it, these are playable run patches from the EastWest Hollywood library. They sound great. Add that in there. We have some woodwind stuff I wanted to add, doing the same thing, so let's put these in there. There you have that. And now the final chord sounds like this. Something's still missing though. What is it? Oh yeah, it's the smallest, littlest, dinkiest, littlest instrument called a triangle. When paired with the rest of the orchestra, it makes a difference. Listen, you'll hear it. All right, so now we have the ending section finished. We already took care of the beginning section over here. But what about this little empty section here, this transitional area between the two? You might have noticed that it was just blank when I was in the piano stage, and that's because I wasn't so inspired by the pianos to do anything there. So I knew I would just go, okay, when I get to orchestration, I'll come up with that little, 5-second spot. We'll see what happens. So playing out of this final chord, major chord, turn to minor, and then modulated to a major. Once I've finished writing the track, the next step is to mix. I don't like this guy staring at me. Now, I like to mix as I go, as I write, so that I have less work to do later, and I can tell as I'm writing, is this working or not? But there's always more to do. It's two different jobs. And depending on the project, there's two ways I would go about it. Option one would be to mix directly in the session that I wrote it in. This can be a little bit faster, but I find it somewhat limiting. So I usually want to go with option two if I have the time, and that is to bounce audio stems and start a new project. Mixing with audio stems instead of all the MIDI and software libraries has the advantage of not bogging down your system by having to think of all the sample libraries and MIDI notes and all that stuff. All that stuff is in a different project. You also have the advantage of not having a bunch of MIDI firing when you're trying to move the playhead around and you have to wait for sounds to die down. I'll move the playhead around and hit pause and unpause in here. Listen to what happens. That's a lot to wait for when you're trying to fly through it. So here we are in a new session where I've imported all my stems, and now we're dealing with audio files instead of MIDI information. So now, when I start and stop, check this out. Much cleaner. I'll go over mixing techniques in another video. This one's gone on long enough. So I'll just say for now, there's EQs and compression and reverbs to think about. But for now, I'll just go ahead and play the finished product for you. Thanks for sticking around. I like you. Oh, hi! I didn't see you there. You've just walked in on me pretending to take a drink out of this empty mug. I'm a idiot.